Hi class, what we're going to take a look at for the next few lectures are complex societies forming around 5 great river basins in the world, the rise of civilization as we might know it today. Early urbanization is going to bring changes including new technology, monumental building, new religions, writing, distinct social structures, and specialized labor. Long-distance trade is also going to begin to connect many of these Afro-Eurasian societies. Still, despite impressive developments in urbanization, most people will continue to live in villages or in pastoral nomadic communities. But all in all, we're going to see the rise of the first city-states between 4000 and 2000 BCE. All right, let's define civilization. These early civilizations we'll talk about ultimately define what civilization means. And I want you to ask yourself, does this sound like we live today? These first societies were clustered around river basins and were called riverine societies. You can think of Mesopotamia and the Tigris and Euphrates River. Another example is Egypt with the Nile River. We'll get around to talking about Harappa and the Indus River region in India, China, the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers. So birth of civilizations as we know it has begun around these river basins. So what does this early civilization look like? Civilization, just that word, it sounds good, right? But I think you're going to see that there's some pros and cons to civilization. There's unique qualities attributed to the riverine societies. And several world history themes are going to begin to emerge between 4000 and 2000 BCE. For example, the rise of urbanization is going to lead to a quest for order. You're going to need a political and military system to make this happen, right? Among other things. And as these Neolithic villages increase in size and specialization, conflicts between residents and those on the hinterland will lead to the need for control and rule. Over time, we're going to talk about the rise of complex legal codes. We need laws, right? Concerns over wealth protections, and paternity issues will lead to an increasing restriction on women's social freedom. And this will lead us to a set of cultural norms that spread through Southwest Asia and the Mediterranean, and this patriarchal society will emerge during this time. Control of technology, tools and weapons, resources, plus trade routes can influence which community is the wealthiest and the most powerful. And religion will become not only a tool of control, but a strong influence on how certain civilizations will develop. So the big question will remain as to how will leaders, government, military, control the people. And in this class, we're going to look at many different ways that they have controlled society. There's distinct pros and cons, like I said, of civilization. It sounds good. And the developments of these early civilizations in the Mesopotamia region are going to soon be adopted by other cultures that are emerging in the outer regions. But the first big 3 civilizations we're going to discuss is in the Mesopotamia region near the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, and that's the civilization of Sumer. Harappa, again, located in the Indus River Valley region in Egypt on the Nile, it will also be covered in the next couple of lectures. And I'll probably have time to cover China on the Yangtze and Yellow rivers and maybe a little bit about South America too. So one of the first urban centers that we're going to talk about is the Sumerian civilization located in the Mesopotamia region of the ancient city of Uruk. And this is present-day Iraq. Considered the cradle of civilization, it was located on one of the branches of the Euphrates River, and it's considered the first city-state. And at its high tide, 10,000 plus people called it home, and it became a commercial and administration center, a huge walled society, a gated community. There were early forms of irrigation and canals allowing water from the Euphrates to reach the city center. The city had potters and metalsmiths, brickmakers, jewelers, scribes, and priests also populated the city. It was really the first city of its kind in the world, and it was truly a turning point. Other early cities of the Sumer civilization were the Babylonians, Eridu, and Nippur by around 3500 to 3200 BCE. And a handful of these remarkable societies will cluster on the banks or deltas of the region's rivers. So think about this. So cities are scarce and only in select areas, but they all had one thing in common. They're going to need that stable river system and control. Beginnings of government or politics emerged hand in hand with religion or a polytheistic society. So what is a polytheistic society, class? That means that there is the worship of multiple gods. Class, living a settled lifestyle with a steady food and water sources allowed for the invention of new technologies like the first writing system we'll talk about, and the rise of religion, where each city had its own god or goddess it worshipped. And then the creation of the first urban-rural divide. This is going to be very important. Urban is a city-state type dwelling, and rural is the outer lands, the hinterlands, the farmlands. There's going to be many sources of conflicts between those who live in the city-state and those who live in the outer regions. There's the transhumant herders. They're closely affiliated with agricultural villages. They have a lot of trade with them within the city-states, but they move their livestock seasonally. But then there's the nomadic pastoralist. They sound real gentle, don't they? But they're not. They're going to flourish farther away from settled villages, often characterized as a horse riding society with no fixed settlements. You can think of the Eurasian Mongolian steppes. So these people will come into great conflicts with the city-state dwellers that we'll go over during the time that we cover in between 3000 and 1000 BCE. The cities began to exchange goods produced for grain, food, and animal products. Things like cedar wood from the Lebanon regions, copper and tin from Turkey and Iraq, lapis lazuli and other precious gemstones from places like Afghanistan and India, as civilization begins to spread. Advancement of tools is going to lead us to call this the Bronze Age. They added copper with tin and arsenic to allow for a more harder, valuable weapon. But as all this was developing and emerging, this is going to lead us to competition for resources and development of social stratification. So we can all come together for trade, politics, and religion, but we need to answer the question, how should we live? And we're going to discuss that. I want to talk a minute about the Tigris and the Euphrates. These two rivers will mark the life of early inhabitants and shape their worldview. The Tigris and the Euphrates are extremely wild and unpredictable. They're really a system of shallow, salty lakes and marshes and swamps that come together. Class, Saddam Hussein almost dried up most of its tributaries. He essentially destroyed a 5,000-year-old culture. But nonetheless, they still exist today, and there are still people who fight over these tributaries. We're going to find that Mesopotamia is the birthplace of writing. Scribes become one of the most powerful classes of society. And why do you think? They were the world's first record keepers, the world's first readers. And early Sumerian society experiments with pictographs, or clay tokens and images carved on stones to convey messages and record things. Scribes advance this further with a rebus, or a picture representing a word. and later class the cuneiform, were signs pressed into wet clay with the end of a reed, and it was a way to communicate like never before. And over 800 years, this cuneiform was enhanced to control and transmit ideas, record history, and sacred text. It really profoundly changes the human experience. As city life and literacy expands, they give rise to not only documents, record keeping, but also written narrative stories of the people and their origin. One example is the Temple Hymns, written about 2100 BCE. It describes 35 divine sanctuaries and a list of the Sumerian king line, and also recipes for beer. Though they had the resources to manage agriculture, the Mesopotamia region was deficient in most natural resources, and so to construct their cities, it depended in a large part on trade with neighboring regions. Just like I said, they're getting wood from somewhere else and copper and stones from other places. Also, there was a lot of trade that's going to begin in things like spices. Pepper at one time was a form of currency. This was called a trickle-down or down-the-line trade. And the physical openness of Mesopotamia's boundaries eased the movement of people and goods into the region, making it a crossroads, if you will. It led, meanwhile, to the growth of its cities. Several important cultures developed in this context. The Sumerians were the first, the Hurrians in the north, and the Akkadians in the west. We're going to see the rise of the Akkadians in a short time. Outposts at these borders were established to coordinate and monitor resources, and trading stations or entrepôts allowed for multiple exchanges and will develop a pack animal caravans of donkey, wild asses, and camels. The Americas class are not completely different. They're going to develop trade routes over jade, salt, cacao beans, gold, and shells. But more about them later. Let's look at more details about those early cities of Sumer. As populations grew, many migrated from rural areas to these city centers where new opportunities are now possible. And the earliest cities of Sumer in the south include Eridu, Nippur, and Uruk. These grew gradually over hundreds of years and often just as clusters of mud brick buildings, but they were built up over time. In Eridu, for example, its temple was rebuilt 20 times, each more elaborate than the last, to honor Eridu's god, Ea. Such temples were at the center of all Sumerian cities, and they were points of worship for the accumulation of wealth to which inhabitants devoted their attention and resources. This basic urban model results in the city-state. All told, I believe there's more than 35 city-states developing during this period. They were roughly equal in power, and each had a major divine sanctuary and guardian-type deity. In addition to the temple and official buildings located at the edge of cities, the city center was organized around a canal where different craftspeople worked. And in this way, city-states were both commercial and religious centers. And this really captured the social hierarchy of society in the city. Class, if you build a great city, what does that say about you? That you're rich. And this is going to develop into some external problems with nomadic type people and tribes who might want to see what you have in that great city. Sumerians and later Akkadians believed that their gods had established all of this trade, the agricultural and the wealth, and they could control everything around them for good or bad. Each city, like I said, has its own god specific to the area. And each city's god was housed in its major temple, and the inhabitants believed that their god determined the city's character, the institutions, the relationships with neighbors, and just the general welfare of the people. The temple took the form of a large-scale stepped ziggurat by 3000 BCE, flanked by buildings for priests, officials, laborers, and servants. So it was thus not a strictly religious site, it served other purposes. But there, the people engaged on God's estate in productive and commercial activities, which employed an enormous workforce in agricultural and manufacturing. Class, gods could give, but they could also take away. Gods must be feared and revered. Over time, as the religious elite grew, a development of sort of a doom and gloom and negative outlook will prevail in the Mesopotamia region. Their cities often experience floods, droughts, nomadic invasion, and a harsh environment. The Tigris and the Euphrates were very unpredictable rivers. Now, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a 2nd millennium BCE composition, captured this worldview that's emerging. It's the oldest surviving work of literature known, and Gilgamesh was the 5th king of Uruk. So legend has it he ruled for 126 years. No. He's part myth, but he's also part real too. Gilgamesh was the king, and he turned out to be in the Epic of Gilgamesh, sort of a Mesopotamian superhero. He was the lead figure in a set of stories that were put together in this Epic of Gilgamesh. And it was sort of what some scholars refer to as a bromance between him and his best friend Enkidu. Stories about them and how they kill evil things and rescue citizens from evil and battle the gods and learn life lessons along the way. He was, according to the text, the man to whom all things were known. And the Epic of Gilgamesh also has one of the earliest flood stories. But it was overall a gloomy life for Gilgamesh. And this is a quote from the Epic of Gilgamesh. "Life which you look for, you will never find. For when the gods created man, they let death be his share and life be withheld in their own hand." Read it, class, if you get a chance.